Hi, this is Rage from the band Kane. In this video, we're going to take a look at Lightning to the Nations by Diamond Head. Before getting into the meat of the album, we've got to look at why this album wasn't as successful as you would expect it to be. After all, it is one of the best albums to come out of the new wave of British heavy metal, and one of the best rock and metal albums ever released. However, it just didn't get the push it deserved, and there's a lot of reasons for that. The album was originally demoed in 1977 and 1979 before they hit the studio in 1980. Essentially, the album was recorded almost out of frustration. Frustration from the band themselves, but also their manager, Linda Harris. They'd seen bands like Iron Maiden and Def Leppard get signed and start to be pushed, and they were worried that they were going to miss the train. Therefore, they rushed to get the album recorded. They couldn't find a label to sign the band to support the recording and the release of the album, so they self-released it. Now, in this day and age, that's a lot easier to do because you have access to good artists, you have access to good studios, and you can do a lot of that yourself. And obviously, you can distribute your stuff online through CD Baby, DistroKid, and all those distributors. Back then, you were reliant on, in Britain, very much independent metal and rock labels. That's if you weren't signed to one of the big labels like Maiden were. So it was recorded at an old Smithy recording studio, which is in Worcester. Because of the nature of the self-release, they couldn't afford to actually print the record, not properly. And that's why the original version of the album was called the White Album, because it had no cover, it had no track listing. It was just a plain black vinyl in a white sleeve. And that's because they got that cheap. They got it cheap from a nearby factory that was able to produce them at a low cost for them. Unfortunately, this DIY approach didn't help the band's momentum at all, because compared to what their competitors were putting out, this was a plain white sleeve with an album in it. And they did try and market it. They put an advert in Sounds magazine, but then they didn't pay for the advert. They ended up being taken to small claims court, I believe. And the British metal scene at the time was very small, and their reputation was being damaged. And allegedly, a lot of this was Linda Harris's doing. That was the singer's mum. Sean Harris was the singer, and she managed the band at this stage. Given the budget, they only had a week to record the album. And despite that, it actually sounds pretty good for it. The frustrating thing is Diamond Head at the time did have a following. They did have good momentum. There had been support to Iron Maiden. There had been support to AC/DC. They were growing, but this was a huge misstep. Printing an album back then with no cover, putting it out in a magazine that you can't even afford to pay the advertising fees on, it was just not going to go well from that point onwards. The album has subsequently had loads of re-releases. It's been given a cover. It's been given a name. It's now known as Lightning to the Nations rather than the White Album. But still, that took several years to do. They lost so much ground doing it this way. Had they just waited for a label to come along to finance a recording studio, to finance an actual promotional push for the album, they would have been so much more successful. And the panic about falling behind the others probably did them more damage than anything else. Due to the budget, the first pressing of the album was limited to just 1,000 copies, and they were sold for £3.50 each. In the early 90s, Metal Blade would put the album out on CD for the first time. Of course, the original plain sleeve cover version is the most valuable one, so if you can get hold of one of those, that's a real collector's piece, and they go for a small fortune. Despite these humble beginnings, Lightning to the Nations is regarded as one of the best rock and metal albums ever recorded, but most importantly, it influenced Metallica and subsequently Megadeth. And Metallica's debut album, Kill 'Em All, is very much a tribute to Diamond Head and massively influenced by Lightning to the Nations. Brian Tatler's guitar playing on the album has been widely praised over the years. He has a very much a classical style with his playing, but he's just exceptional at writing riffs. In fact, the Japanese metal magazine Burn rated Lightning to the Nations the third best riff album of all time. Even Rolling Stone magazine rated Lightning to the Nations as one of the top 100 greatest metal albums of all time. It's just that well respected. Sean Harris's vocal performance on the album is incredible. He's one of NWOBHM's greatest frontmen, but he's largely forgotten about in this day and age because he didn't continue on with Diamond Head, and he never had a band after Diamond Head that gained any notoriety. Obviously, Brian Tatler is a well-respected guitar player, and he's very much still active. Diamond Head is currently on hiatus while he's playing with the band Saxon, but he's still very much at the forefront of metal and NWOBHM with Saxon. Also on the album were bassist Colin Kimberley and drummer Duncan Scott. They're both great players, and however, they left the band in subsequent years, so again, they've been largely forgotten about. For me, Lightning to the Nations is arguably the strongest debut from any of the NWOBHM bands, which makes it even more sad that it never gained the commercial success it deserved. Poor decisions from management at that critical time, when the album release had to be perfect, damaged this album so much, and it fell by the wayside, and it should never have fell by the wayside. It is that good of an album. This is as good as an album by any band you can think of in the metal sphere. It's as good as anything done by Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, Iron Maiden, Saxon, Metallica, Megadeth, anyone you can think of really. So if it's that good, what about the songs? Well, it opens with the song Lightning to the Nations, obviously the title track. Fantastic song. It really does set the pace for the whole record. And if you love NWOBHM, you'll love this track. It's followed up by The Prince, another fantastic song, another song that's influenced bands like Metallica, like Megadeth. Then there's Suckin' My Love, obviously crude subject matter by today's standards, but they've somehow managed to make that into an epic metal song. Of course, the song that's best known from the album is Am I Evil, popularized by Metallica's cover back in the early 80s. Sweet and Innocent is another great track. It's electric, Helpless, they're all really good songs. There isn't a bad song on this album. I'll keep repeating that because I really believe that. Of course, you always get people who will say things like, well, if the songs were that good, how comes the album failed? Well, albums can fail because of marketing. You know, it's the tree falling in wood scenario. If no one's around to hear it, it simply won't make a sound. And that's the case with records. You can have the best record you could ever make. And if no one's able to hear it because your marketing's not correct, and certainly back then you were reliant on labels and radio stations and magazines to talk about you, to promote you. And if you didn't have that, you had nothing. And unfortunately, this was one of the ones that just fell by the wayside. So while the songs are some of the best in the NWOBHM movement, they simply didn't have the traction. And it wasn't until Metallica covered them that people really knew the songs at all. And unfortunately, the album is long out of print. There are two versions of it. The original one has a different master from the one that got re-released in the 80s. And that's the one that ended up on the CD. It's not on streaming services at the moment. The only version you can get is the 2020 re-release. On the re-release, you had the then current lineup of Diamond Head playing the album through and full. But it's not just the album. There are a number of covers on there. There's No Remorse, which is a Metallica cover. There's Immigrant Song by Led Zeppelin, Sinner by Judas Priest, and Rat Bat Blue by Deep Purple. There's nothing particularly wrong or bad about the re-release. It's actually a really good re-recording of the album. However, I'd like to have the option to listen to the original. And that's one of the downsides to streaming services, is that bands and labels can take albums away from you if you don't own them physically. I do own a copy of the original, but I would like to be able to listen to it on my Spotify on the way to work on occasion. So what can I say in summary? Lightning to the Nations is a great album, arguably the best debut release from any of the NWOBHM bands. It was greatly let down by marketing and how it was released at the time. However, if you can go back and listen to it, I really suggest you do. Thank you so much for taking time to listen and watch this video. I hope you join me again soon on this channel. I'll keep doing these sorts of videos as we go forward. So if you liked what you've heard, chuck us a like, chuck us a comment, subscribe, and help support us grow.